Listen to me, boy. You are unfit for VIP status, and you will move to the back of this aircraft right now, or I'll have you dragged off in handcuffs." The words hung in the recycled air of the first-class cabin like a toxic cloud, recorded by 50 smartphones and witnessed by a United States senator. But Captain David Cross had no idea that the man he was threatening held the power to end his career with a single phone call. The rain at JFK International Airport wasn't just falling. It was attacking the tarmac, with the fury of nature unleashed, turning the world outside Terminal 4 into a gray, blurred nightmare that had already delayed Flight 847 by 45 minutes. Inside the cockpit of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, Captain David Cross checked his Rolex for the fourth time in 3 minutes, his jaw clenched so tight it could crack walnuts. David wasn't just any pilot. He was aviation royalty third-generation cockpit command, with his grandfather flying bombers over Berlin and his father captaining 747s for Pan Am back when airlines were glamorous and passengers dressed up to fly. At 48, David had the kind of silver-streaked temples and squared shoulders that looked like they were designed in a casting director's office, and he wore his authority like a tailored uniform, pressed and perfect and utterly uncompromising. This wasn't just another flight for David. Next month marked his seniority review, the evaluation that would determine whether he moved up to international routes and the kind of prestige assignments that separated the legends from the ordinary pilots who just moved people from point A to point B. Every detail mattered, every passenger interaction was a reflection of his command, and David had built his reputation on running the tightest, most professional operation in the sky. "Fuel load confirmed," Captain said First Officer Elena Martinez, a sharp 29-year-old who had earned her stripes flying cargo planes through desert storms before joining Skyward Airlines. Elena was brilliant, precise, and absolutely terrified of David Cross, which was exactly how David preferred his flight deck relationships to be structured. About time, David snapped, adjusting his gold pilot wings with the unconscious habit of a man who had been polishing his image for decades. "What's the passenger manifest looking like? I saw Senator Williams on the VIP list, plus the CEO of Cloud Tech Industries. I want this flight smoother than silk, Elena. No turbulence, no delays, and absolutely no disruptions in the forward cabin." David's ritual was sacred and unchanging. Before every flight, he personally walked through the first-class cabin to ensure everything met his exacting standards. He needed to see the champagne glasses gleaming, the leather seats spotless, and most importantly, he needed to assess whether the passengers looked like they belonged in the rarefied air of premium service. To David, first class wasn't just about the seat you bought. It was about the image you projected, and that image needed to reflect the kind of exclusivity that justified $10,000 tickets. "Boarding is almost complete," Elena reported, glancing at her iPad with the concentration of someone who had learned that David's perfectionism left no room for errors. "We're just waiting on one late arrival for Seat 1A. David's eyebrows shot up like warning flags. Seat 1A was the throne of the aircraft, usually reserved for senators, CEOs, or passengers whose platinum status came with the kind of spending power that kept airlines profitable. "Who is it?" he asked, already calculating how this delay would affect his precious on-time performance record. Elena scrolled through the manifest, her finger stopping at the entry that would change everything. "Name is Daniel Washington. No corporate title listed, no frequent flyer history in our system. He paid cash at the ticket counter about an hour ago, apparently." The information hit David like a red flag in a hurricane. Cash payments were unusual enough in an era of digital transactions, but cash for a first-class international seat raised every alarm bell in David's security-conscious mind. In his experience, last-minute cash purchases usually meant one of three things: drug money fraud, or someone trying to avoid detection by law enforcement. Cash for first class, David set his voice dropping to the dangerous tone that Elena had learned to recognize as the prelude to one of his legendary explosions. That's 15 grand, Elena. People don't just walk around with that kind of money unless they're up to something. Keep a close eye on this Washington character. I have a feeling we're going to have problems. The man walking down the jet bridge didn't look like David's mental image of a first-class passenger, and that disconnect sent alarm bells ringing in the captain's prejudice-trained mind. Daniel Washington was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of commanding respect in rooms where respect wasn't freely given. He wore a charcoal gray hoodie that looked expensive if you knew how to recognize quality, but to a casual observer might seem inappropriately casual for a $15,000 seat. His jeans were dark and well-fitted. His sneakers were clean, but clearly chosen for comfort over style, and he carried a battered leather duffel bag that looked like it had survived more airport security lines than most pilots saw in a career. Around his neck hung noise-canceling headphones, and everything about his appearance suggested someone who traveled frequently but prioritized function over the kind of flashy display that David associated with legitimate first-class passengers. What David couldn't see and wouldn't have understood if he had was that Daniel Washington moved through airports with the practiced ease of someone who spent his life evaluating aviation operations from the inside. Every step Daniel took was measured. Every glance was cataloging details, and the small leather notebook he pulled from his pocket wasn't for jotting down vacation thoughts. It was for documenting regulatory compliance in real time. Daniel stopped at seat 1A, placed his duffel bag in the overhead compartment with the efficient motions of an experienced traveler, and settled into his seat with the kind of relaxed alertness that came from knowing exactly where he belonged. He pulled out his notebook and clicked his pen, beginning the process that had become second nature over years of conducting unannounced audits of airline operations. From the galley area, David Cross watched this entire sequence unfold with growing irritation that had nothing to do with operational concerns and everything to do with his deeply ingrained assumptions about who deserved to sit in premium seats. To David's eye, Daniel looked completely out of place among the business suits and designer handbags of first class, like someone who had wandered into the wrong section of the aircraft and was too stubborn or too ignorant to realize his mistake. Jessica Rivera, the lead flight attendant with 18 years of experience reading passenger dynamics and captain moods, noticed David's expression and felt her stomach tighten with the familiar dread that came when her captain's biases started overriding his professional judgment. Jessica had seen this look before, and it never ended well for anyone involved. Jessica, David said, his voice carrying the kind of barely controlled tension that made experienced flight crews nervous. Who exactly is that passenger in 1A? That's Mr. Washington. Captain. Jessica replied, checking her manifest with the hope that somehow the information would calm David's obviously agitated state. He's the late arrival we were waiting for. David stared at Daniel with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey, his mind racing through scenarios that had more to do with his own prejudices than any actual security concerns. Look at him, Jessica. Really look at him. Does he strike you as the kind of person who belongs in a $15,000 seat? The hoodie, the casual clothes, the way he's sitting there like he owns the place? Jessica glanced back at Daniel, who was quietly writing in his notebook while occasionally looking out the window at the rain-soaked tarmac. He appeared completely calm, utterly professional, and absolutely unthreatening, which made David's agitation all the more concerning to her experienced eye. "He seems fine," Captain Jessica said carefully, using the diplomatic tone that flight crews perfected for managing difficult situations. He boarded politely, his ticket scanned properly, and he hasn't caused any disturbances. But David was already building his case in his mind, connecting dots that existed only in his imagination, and constructing a narrative that would justify the decision he was already determined to make. It's not about disturbances, Jessica. It's about standards. We sell an image here, a premium experience that passengers pay top dollar to enjoy. When someone who clearly doesn't fit that image occupies our most visible seat, it degrades the entire first-class experience for everyone else. David's paranoia was feeding on itself now, growing stronger with every passing moment as he watched Daniel Washington sit calmly in seat 1. Completely unaware that he had become the target of a captain's misplaced authority and deeply buried racial bias. In David's mind, Daniel's presence was becoming less about a passenger who had paid for his seat and more about a challenge to the natural order of things that David believed he was responsible for maintaining. "I want you to go over there and ask to see his boarding pass again," David instructed Jessica, his voice taking on the kind of commanding tone that brooked no argument. "Tell him there was some kind of system glitch and we need to re-verify his ticket information. Check his ID too. I want to make absolutely certain that he actually belongs in that seat." Jessica felt her professional instincts warring with her years of training to follow crew hierarchy. Everything about this request felt wrong to her experienced judgment, but challenging a captain's direct order was the kind of career-limiting move that flight attendants learned to avoid. Captain, the gate agents already verified his boarding pass and identification. The system shows he's checked in properly. Jessica David said, stepping closer to her with the kind of physical presence that was meant to intimidate and control. "I am responsible for the safety and comfort of every passenger on this aircraft. If I have concerns about someone's legitimacy, it is my duty and my right to investigate those concerns. Now, either you can handle this professionally or I can handle it myself. But either way, it's getting done. The threat was implicit, but clear follow orders or face the consequences." Jessica smoothed her uniform skirt and walked toward seat 1, carrying with her the terrible certainty that she was about to become a participant in something that would shame her for years to come. Daniel looked up as she approached, and Jessica was struck by the intelligence and calm authority in his eyes. This wasn't the look of someone who was out of place or trying to scam his way into a premium seat. This was the look of someone who belonged exactly where he was sitting, regardless of what assumptions others might make about his appearance. "Mr. Washington," Jessica said, trying to inject as much professionalism and courtesy into her voice as possible. "I'm terribly sorry to bother you, sir, but we're having some technical issues with our passenger manifest system. Would you mind showing me your boarding pass one more time? It's just a routine verification." Daniel held her gaze for a moment that felt loaded with understanding, as if he could see straight through her polite words to the uncomfortable reality of why she was really standing there. But instead of arguing or demanding explanations, he simply reached into his pocket and produced his boarding pass with the kind of calm cooperation that spoke to years of experience dealing with situations exactly like this one. "Of course," Daniel said, his voice carrying the deep, measured tones of someone accustomed to professional conversations. "Here you are." Jessica examined the boarding pass with unnecessary thoroughness, already knowing that everything would be perfectly legitimate. Seat 1. "A Daniel Washington," she confirmed, though her heart was sinking with every word. "And your frequent flyer status shows as Platinum Premier, though, for some reason, our system isn't displaying your flight history." "System glitches happen," Daniel replied with a slight smile that somehow managed to be both understanding and knowing. "Is there anything else you need to verify?" Jessica wanted to apologize, wanted to tell him that this wasn't her idea and that she knew perfectly well he belonged in that seat. But professionalism and crew hierarchy kept her responses neutral. "No, sir. That's everything. Can I get you something to drink before we push back? We have champagne or perhaps some water." "Water would be perfect," Daniel said. "No ice, please." As Jessica walked back toward the galley, she felt the weight of David's expectant stare, and knew that the information she was about to deliver wouldn't satisfy his growing obsession with removing Daniel Washington from seat 1A. The boarding pass was legitimate, the passenger was polite and cooperative, and every professional instinct Jessica possessed told her that they were about to make a terrible mistake. "Well," David demanded, his arms crossed and his expression already showing disappointment at what he expected to hear. "Everything checks out," Captain Jessica reported, though she could see the information bouncing off David's predetermined conclusions like rain off a windshield. "His boarding pass is legitimate, his ID matches, and he's actually showing Platinum Premier status in our system. There's no indication of any problems whatsoever." David's face darkened with the kind of frustration that came when reality refused to conform to his assumptions. "Platinum status doesn't just appear out of nowhere, Jessica. Either there's been some kind of error in our system, or we're looking at fraudulent use of someone else's account. I'm not comfortable with this situation, and I'm certainly not comfortable with the image he's projecting in our premium cabin." The mask was slipping now, and Jessica could see the real motivations driving David's behavior. This wasn't about security concerns or system errors. This was about a captain who had decided that Daniel Washington didn't look like the kind of person who should be sitting in first class, and who was determined to find a justification for that predetermined conclusion. "Captain, we're already behind schedule," Jessica warned, making one last attempt to redirect David's attention toward the operational realities they were facing. "If we delay any further for additional passenger screening, we're going to miss our takeoff slot and end up sitting on the tarmac for hours." But David Cross had already moved beyond the point where practical considerations could override his wounded sense of authority and propriety. In his mind, this had become a test of his command, a challenge to his ability to maintain the standards that separated premium aviation from common transportation, and he was not about to back down from that challenge regardless of the consequences. The cockpit door didn't open with the professional grace that passengers expected from their flight crew. It burst open with the violent energy of a man whose authority had been questioned and who was determined to reassert control through any means necessary. David Cross emerged from his sanctuary of command without his pilot's cap. His silver hair slightly disheveled, and his face set in the kind of grim determination that made experienced flight crews step back and passengers stop their conversations to stare. This wasn't the confident stride of a captain conducting a routine cabin inspection. This was the march of a man who had convinced himself that his entire career, his family legacy, and his professional reputation were under attack by a passenger who had committed the unforgivable sin of looking like he didn't belong in first class while having the audacity to actually belong there legally and financially. The first-class cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence as David walked the aisle with the mechanical precision of a soldier heading into battle. Senator Williams lowered his newspaper to watch the unfolding drama, his experienced political instincts recognizing the tension that preceded public disasters. The Cloud Tech CEO discreetly activated her phone's video recording feature, her business survival instincts telling her that she was about to witness something that needed to be documented. David stopped directly beside seat 1, positioning himself so that his physical presence would block the overhead light and create the kind of intimidating shadow that he had learned to use for asserting dominance in difficult situations. This was psychological warfare, the deliberate use of body language and spatial dynamics to make another human being feel small and threatened. And David had perfected these techniques over years of managing what he considered to be unruly passengers and insubordinate crew members. Sir David said, his voice carrying none of the courtesy that the word usually implied. This wasn't the sir of customer service or professional respect. This was the sir that police officers used when they were about to make an arrest loaded with authority and the promise of consequences for anyone who dared to challenge it. Daniel slowly capped his pen and looked up from his notebook, his expression remaining completely neutral despite the obvious aggression radiating from the man towering over his seat. Years of experience in high-pressure situations had taught Daniel the value of remaining calm when others were losing control, and his measured response to David's intimidation tactics only served to further inflame the captain's sense of challenged authority. "Yes," Captain Daniel replied, his voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that made David's aggressive posture look even more inappropriate by contrast. "Is there something I can help you with?" David leaned forward slightly, invading Daniel's personal space with the deliberate intent of creating discomfort and establishing dominance. "I need to see your identification again. Right now." The request was phrased as a demand, and every passenger within hearing range could feel the tension escalating beyond the bounds of normal airline operations. This wasn't a routine security check or a polite verification of travel documents. This was a confrontation that had nothing to do with legitimate airline procedures and everything to do with a captain who had decided that Daniel Washington was a problem that needed to be eliminated. Daniel remained seated, maintaining his dignity while responding to David's increasingly hostile behavior with the kind of professional calm that came from years of dealing with difficult personalities in positions of authority. "I already showed my boarding pass and identification to your flight attendant, Captain. She verified everything just a few minutes ago. Is there some kind of specific problem you're concerned about?" The question was reasonable, logical, and completely infuriating to David, whose entire justification for this confrontation was based on assumptions and biases that couldn't withstand the light of rational examination. Rather than backing down or providing a legitimate explanation, David doubled down on his aggressive approach, escalating the situation toward the point of no return. "The problem," David said, his voice rising slightly so that passengers several rows back could hear every word, "is that I have reason to believe you are in violation of our dress code and passenger conduct policies for the first-class cabin." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the cabin like a small earthquake. In an era when billionaires wore flip-flops to board meetings and tech CEOs conducted business in hoodies, the idea of a dress code for airline passengers seemed absurdly outdated. But David was committed to his chosen path of justification regardless of how ridiculous it made him appear. Daniel raised an eyebrow with the kind of controlled surprise that suggested he had heard similar accusations before and found them more sad than offensive. "My hoodie is cashmere, Captain, and I haven't said a word to anyone since I boarded. How exactly is my conduct in violation of your policies?" The calm logic of Daniel's response only served to further enrage David, who was now trapped between his need to justify his actions and the growing awareness that his justifications were becoming increasingly absurd under public scrutiny. Rather than admit his error, David chose to escalate further, pushing the confrontation toward a conclusion that would destroy his career and reputation. David Cross had reached the point of no return, that moment in human conflict where pride and prejudice override common sense and professional judgment, leading to decisions that cannot be undone and consequences that cannot be avoided. The entire first-class cabin had become a theater for his demonstration of misplaced authority, and every passenger was now a witness to what would soon become a case study in how personal bias can destroy a career in a matter of minutes. "You're making the other passengers uncomfortable." David lied with the smooth confidence of a man who had convinced himself that his prejudices were actually professional insights. He gestured vaguely toward the other first-class seats, as if the senator reading his newspaper and the CEO recording on her phone were somehow distressed by Daniel's presence, rather than fascinated by David's increasingly erratic behavior. "I see," Daniel replied, his tone suggesting that he saw much more than David realized. "And which passengers have expressed this discomfort to you directly?" The question was a trap that David walked into with the blind confidence of someone who believed his authority made him immune to challenges. "That's not the point. As captain of this aircraft, I am responsible for ensuring that all passengers enjoy the premium experience they paid for. Your appearance and demeanor are inconsistent with the standards we maintain in this cabin." Senator Williams shifted in his seat, his decades of political experience allowing him to recognize the sound of a career ending in real time. The Cloud Tech CEO continued recording her business instincts, telling her that she was documenting something that would have significant value in the very near future. Even Elena Martinez, watching from the cockpit doorway, felt her stomach clench with the certainty that her captain was about to destroy not just his own career, but potentially hers as well. "I have made a command decision," David announced with the dramatic flair of someone who believed he was demonstrating strong leadership rather than revealing his fundamental unfitness for command. "I am relocating you to a seat in our premium economy section where you will be more comfortable and where your presence will not impact the first-class experience of our VIP passengers." The announcement hit the cabin like a physical blow, and several passengers audibly gasped at the blatant discrimination they were witnessing. This wasn't a security concern or an operational necessity. This was a captain using his authority to enforce his personal prejudices, and everyone present could see it for exactly what it was. Daniel Washington had faced discrimination before, had dealt with people who looked at his skin color and made assumptions about his education, his profession, and his right to occupy spaces that they considered exclusively their own. But this situation was different because it was happening in public, being recorded by multiple devices and being carried out by someone whose federal license gave him the legal authority to remove passengers from aircraft. Captain Daniel said, his voice dropping to a register that somehow conveyed both respect and warning in equal measure. "I paid full fare for this seat. I am not causing any disturbance. I am not violating any legitimate airline policies, and I am certainly not making anyone uncomfortable except possibly you. I am not moving, and I strongly suggest you return to your cockpit and focus on getting this aircraft to its destination safely and on time." The response was measured professional and completely devastating in its calm refusal to accept David's authority to discriminate. Daniel wasn't shouting or arguing or giving David any excuse to escalate to physical confrontation. He was simply stating facts and refusing to participate in his own humiliation, which made David's position look even more unreasonable and illegal. David's face flushed red with the kind of rage that comes when someone accustomed to unquestioned authority encounters resistance from someone they consider inferior. The mask of professional authority was slipping completely now, revealing the ugly prejudices that had been driving his behavior from the moment he first saw Daniel Washington in seat 1A. "Listen to me, boy," David snarled, the racial undertone exploding into the open with the force of a dam bursting. "I am the captain of this vessel. My word is law at 30,000 feet. You are unfit for VIP status. You don't belong in this cabin, and you will move to the back of this aircraft right now." The word "boy" hung in the air like poison gas, and every person in the first-class cabin understood exactly what they had just witnessed. This wasn't about dress codes or passenger comfort or airline policies. This was about a white captain using his authority to put a black passenger in his place, and the recording devices that were now openly documenting the confrontation would ensure that this moment of revealed prejudice would be preserved forever. Now David continued, his voice rising to a near shout, as his control completely disintegrated. "You can walk to the back like a gentleman, or I can have law enforcement drag you off this plane in handcuffs for disobeying a direct order from a flight crew member. The choice is yours, but either way, you are leaving this seat." Jessica Rivera stepped forward from the galley area, her 18 years of professional experience finally overriding her trained deference to captain authority as she watched her career and her airline's reputation being destroyed in real time by David Cross's public display of discrimination and abuse of power. "Captain, please," Jessica said, her voice carrying the desperate tone of someone trying to prevent a disaster that was already well underway. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately before." "Stay out of this, Jessica," David barked, not even turning to look at her as he kept his eyes locked on Daniel Washington. "This is a command decision, and I will not have my authority undermined by passengers who think they can intimidate their way into spaces where they don't belong." Daniel Washington sat in his seat with the stillness of someone who had learned through painful experience that any movement, any gesture, any expression could be misinterpreted and used as justification for violence or arrest. He had been in situations like this before, though never quite so public or so clearly recorded and his years of navigating discrimination in professional settings had taught him that his best defense was dignity documentation, and the kind of calm professionalism that made his accusers look foolish and dangerous by contrast. "Call them," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying none of the anger or fear that David expected to hear. "Call law enforcement. Call Port Authority. Call airport security. But I want you to understand something very clearly. Captain Cross, if I leave this seat under protest, this aircraft will not be taking off today, and your career will be over before we reach the gate." The statement was delivered with such quiet confidence that several passengers leaned forward to hear every word, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple passenger dispute. Daniel wasn't making a threat or engaging in the kind of dramatic confrontation that would give David justification for his actions. He was simply stating a fact with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly how much power he actually possessed. David laughed, but it was the kind of bitter, incredulous sound that people make when they realize they've made a terrible mistake but are too committed to their chosen course to change direction. Is that supposed to be a threat? You think you have some kind of power here? You're nobody, Mr. Washington. You're just another passenger who bought a ticket and now thinks that gives you the right to challenge my authority. Without waiting for a response, David turned and walked to the galley phone, his movement sharp and angry as he punched in the code that would connect him to ground operations. "This is Captain Cross on Flight 847. He said, his voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "I need Port Authority officers on the jet bridge immediately. I have a disruptive passenger in seat 1A who is refusing a direct order from the captain and needs to be removed from the aircraft." He slammed the phone back into its cradle with unnecessary force and turned back to Daniel with the expression of triumph that would look absolutely devastating when played back on the evening news. "You wanted law enforcement. You got them. Now we'll see how much power you really think you have when you're being escorted off this plane in handcuffs." Daniel Washington didn't respond to the taunt. Instead, he picked up his pen and opened his notebook again, writing with the kind of careful precision that suggested he was documenting something that would be reviewed by people far more important than an airline captain having a very public breakdown. 10:47 a.m. Daniel wrote, "Captain invoked federal authority to remove passenger based on appearance and race. Multiple witnesses present. Recording devices active. Escalation to law enforcement initiated by captain without legitimate safety concerns." He closed the notebook and sat back in his seat, completely calm despite the chaos swirling around him. To the passengers watching this unfold, Daniel's behavior was puzzling. He seemed far too composed for someone who was about to be arrested and removed from a plane. But Daniel knew something that none of them could guess. He was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was trained to do, and the storm that was about to hit Captain David Cross would be unlike anything the aviation industry had ever seen. The heavy sound of boots on the jet bridge announced the arrival of the Port Authority Police Department, their presence instantly transforming the atmosphere in the first-class cabin from uncomfortable tension to the kind of serious gravity that accompanies federal law enforcement operations. Passengers instinctively sat straighter in their seats. Conversations died away to whispers, and the recording devices that had been discreetly capturing the confrontation became more obvious as people realized they might be documenting something of historical significance. Two officers squeezed through the narrow aircraft doorway, their tactical vests and equipment making them seem impossibly large in the confined space of the first-class cabin. Sergeant Lisa Chen, a 15-year veteran of airport law enforcement, looked around the cabin with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with every conceivable type of passenger disturbance, while Officer Marcus Torres, newer to the job, but experienced in reading the dynamics of tense situations, positioned himself where he could observe all the participants in what was clearly a complex confrontation. Captain Cross Sergeant Chen asked, her voice carrying the professional neutrality that law enforcement officers used when they weren't yet sure which side of a conflict they were being asked to support. David straightened his shoulders and assumed the authoritative posture that he believed would establish his credibility with the officers. "Right here, Sergeant. Thank you for responding so quickly. I have a passenger in Seat 1A who has been belligerent and uncooperative, refusing direct orders from flight crew and creating a disturbance that threatens the safety and comfort of our other passengers." Sergeant Chen turned her attention to Daniel Washington, and her first observation was how utterly calm and composed he appeared compared to the agitated captain who had summoned them. In her experience, truly disruptive passengers were usually obvious. They were loud, angry, intoxicated, or clearly disturbed. The man sitting quietly in Seat 1A looked like he was waiting for a business meeting to begin, Sir Sergeant Chen said, approaching Daniel's seat with the kind of careful professionalism that came from years of de-escalating volatile situations. "The captain has asked us to escort you from the aircraft. I need you to gather your belongings and come with us." Daniel looked up at her with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that made experienced law enforcement officers pay attention in ways they might not have expected. "Officer Daniel said, I am complying with your request because I do not wish to delay these passengers any longer than Captain Cross already has. But I want you to understand that my removal from this aircraft is being conducted under protest, that I have committed no violation of federal aviation regulations or airline policies, and that this situation will be reviewed at the highest levels of aviation authority." The statement was delivered with such professional precision that Sergeant Chen found herself wondering exactly who she was dealing with, but her job was to respond to the captain's request for assistance, not to investigate the underlying dispute between crew and passenger. Daniel stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening as he reached into the overhead compartment and retrieved his battered leather duffel bag. As he slung it over his shoulder, he turned to face David Cross one final time, and the distance between them seemed to represent far more than the few feet of airplane aisle that separated their positions. "Captain Cross," Daniel said, using David's name with the kind of familiarity that made the captain's skin crawl with unease. "You have invoked Federal Aviation Regulation 49 U.S.C. 44,902 to remove a passenger you consider a threat to safety. That is a very serious action with very serious consequences." David wanted to respond with another assertion of his authority, but something in Daniel's tone made him hesitate. There was a certainty in the way Daniel spoke that suggested knowledge far beyond what a typical passenger should possess, but David was too committed to his chosen path to reconsider his actions now. "Save the legal lecture for someone who cares," David said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "Officers, please remove this passenger from my aircraft immediately." As Sergeant Chen and Officer Torres prepared to escort Daniel toward the aircraft door, he reached into his hoodie pocket and produced a business card. Rather than handing it to David directly, Daniel placed it carefully on the armrest of Seat 1A, where it would remain as evidence of this moment long after he was gone. "You're going to need a very good lawyer, Captain Cross," Daniel said with the tone of someone delivering a professional assessment rather than a personal threat. "And you're going to need an even better union representative because when I walk off this jet bridge, the clock starts ticking on what remains of your aviation career." The walk down the aircraft aisle should have been Daniel Washington's moment of shame, the public humiliation that every airline passenger fears when they imagine being forcibly removed from a flight in front of hundreds of judgmental strangers. But as Daniel moved toward the aircraft door, flanked by two Port Authority officers, something extraordinary happened that completely subverted the expected narrative of passenger disgrace and crew authority. Instead of keeping his head down in embarrassment, Daniel made eye contact with each passenger he passed, acknowledging their presence with the kind of respectful nods that successful executives exchange in boardrooms. When he reached Senator Williams, who was watching the proceedings with the fascination of a politician witnessing a career-ending scandal unfold in real time, Daniel paused slightly. "My apologies for the delay," Senator Daniel said with the smooth professionalism of someone accustomed to addressing high-ranking government officials. "I hope this disruption doesn't cause you to miss any important commitments in London." Senator Williams looked up from his newspaper with the startled expression of someone who had just realized he was watching something far more complex than a simple passenger removal. "No harm done," the senator replied automatically, though his political instincts were telling him that he had just witnessed something that would be making headlines very soon. Officer Torres, who was escorting Daniel toward the exit, couldn't shake the feeling that this passenger was unlike anyone he had ever been asked to remove from an aircraft. Most disruptive passengers were either drunk, angry, or clearly mentally unstable, but Daniel Washington seemed more composed and professional than many of the airline executives Torres had dealt with during his years of airport security work. "Am I under arrest?" Daniel asked as they stepped onto the jet bridge, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than concern about the legal implications of his situation. "Not at this time," Sergeant Chen replied, though she was beginning to have serious doubts about the captain's characterization of Daniel as a threatening passenger. "The airline may choose to press charges for interfering with flight crew instructions, but that would be their decision to make." "That won't be necessary," Daniel said with the kind of calm certainty that made both officers wonder exactly what they were missing about this situation. "But I do need to make a phone call before we leave the boarding area." Back on the aircraft, David Cross was experiencing the intoxicating rush of absolute victory that comes when someone believes they have successfully defended their authority against an unworthy challenge. He had cleansed his first-class cabin of what he considered an inappropriate presence, demonstrated his command authority to both passengers and crew, and restored what he believed to be the proper order of things aboard his aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen," David announced to the first-class cabin, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed he had just solved a significant problem. "I sincerely apologize for that unpleasant disruption to your travel experience. Please be assured that Skyward Airlines maintains zero tolerance for passengers who threaten the safety and comfort of our valued customers. We'll be pushing back from the gate momentarily, and champagne service will be complimentary for all first-class passengers as our way of apologizing for the delay." But the response from the passengers was not what David expected. Instead of grateful smiles and appreciative nods, he was met with uncomfortable silence, shifting glances, and the kind of atmosphere that settles over a room where everyone knows they have just witnessed something terrible, but aren't sure how to respond to it. Elena Martinez, who had watched the entire confrontation from the cockpit doorway, felt sick to her stomach as she realized the full implications of what her captain had just done. She had tried to warn him about the legitimacy of Daniel's ticket and status, but David had been too consumed with his own assumptions to listen to reason or professional advice. As David walked back toward the cockpit, Elena noticed the business card that Daniel had left on the armrest of Seat 1A. Something about its presence bothered her like a piece of evidence that didn't fit the narrative David had constructed about removing a disruptive passenger. Before the flight attendants could clear the area for departure, Elena stepped over and picked up the card. What she saw made her blood run cold and her hands start shaking uncontrollably. The card was heavy cream-colored stock with gold embossing, and prominently displayed at the top was the official seal of the United States Department of Transportation. Below that, in crisp black lettering, were the words that would haunt Elena's dreams for years to come. Daniel Washington, Executive Director, Field Operations and Safety Compliance, Federal Aviation Administration. Elena stared at the card, reading and rereading the information as if repetition might somehow change what was printed there. Daniel Washington wasn't just a passenger who had paid cash for a first-class seat. He was the federal official responsible for overseeing aviation safety and regulatory compliance for the entire United States commercial airline industry. Captain Elena called out, her voice cracking with the strain of trying to remain professional while delivering information that would destroy her captain's career and possibly her own. "Captain, you need to see this immediately." David emerged from the cockpit with the irritated expression of someone whose moment of triumph was being interrupted by unnecessary details. "What is it, Elena? We need to get this aircraft moving. We've already lost too much time dealing with that situation." Elena held out the business card with a trembling hand, unable to find words adequate to explain the magnitude of the disaster that David had just created. "Sir, you need to look at this. It's the business card that Mr. Washington left behind." David snatched the card from Elena's hand with the impatient gesture of someone who expected to find more evidence supporting his decision to remove an unworthy passenger. But as his eyes focused on the official government seal and the title Executive Director, Federal Aviation Administration, the color drained from his face like water flowing out of a broken dam. "This can't be real," David whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit. "This has to be fake. It's impossible. The guy was wearing a hoodie, for God's sake." But even as David tried to convince himself that he was looking at an elaborate fraud, his years of aviation experience were telling him that official government credentials weren't something that could be easily counterfeited, and the quality of the card itself spoke to the kind of resources that only legitimate federal agencies possessed. The first sign that David Cross's world was about to collapse completely came through the aircraft's radio system, where the voice of the control tower carried none of the routine professionalism that pilots expected from air traffic control communications. Instead of clearance for pushback and taxi instructions, the radio crackled with the kind of urgent authoritative commands that were reserved for genuine emergencies and federal security situations. "Skyward flight 847. This is JFK ground control," the voice said, cutting through the routine chatter of airport operations with knife-like precision. "Do not repeat, do not move your aircraft. Kill your engines immediately and await further instructions." David stared at the radio with the confused expression of someone whose reality was refusing to conform to his expectations. Engine shutdown orders on the ground were serious business usually reserved for fuel leaks, mechanical emergencies, or security threats that posed immediate danger to passengers and ground personnel. "Ground control, this is Captain Cross," David responded, keying his microphone with hands that had begun to shake slightly. "We are perfectly operational with no mechanical issues or safety concerns. Please confirm your engine shutdown order." The response came not from the regular ground controller, but from a different voice entirely, deeper, more authoritative, carrying the unmistakable tone of federal authority that every pilot was trained to recognize and obey without question. "Captain Cross, this is the tower supervisor. You are ordered to shut down your engines immediately and return to Gate B-15. Your aircraft has been grounded by federal authority, and you are directed to remain in position pending the arrival of FAA officials." Elena Martinez felt her stomach drop as she realized that the business card she had shown David wasn't a fake credential or an elaborate scam. If the FAA was grounding their aircraft and sending officials to meet them, it meant that Daniel Washington was exactly who his credentials claimed he was, and that David's decision to remove him from the flight was about to trigger consequences that would reshape both of their careers. "This is impossible," David muttered, though his hands were already moving to comply with the shutdown order because refusing a direct command from federal aviation authorities wasn't just career suicide, it was a federal crime. That passenger, there's no way he could actually be FAA. Look at how he was dressed. Look at his behavior. But even as David tried to rationalize his disbelief, the massive engines of the Boeing 787 were spinning down into silence, and the aircraft's electrical systems were switching to battery power as the reality of their situation became undeniable. Through the cockpit windows, David could see ground vehicles approaching their position with the kind of urgent coordination that accompanied serious federal investigations. The passenger address system crackled to life as David tried to maintain some semblance of control over a situation that was spiraling completely beyond his authority. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Cross. We're experiencing a minor operational delay and will be returning to the gate for a brief administrative procedure. We apologize for the inconvenience and expect to be airborne shortly. But David's announcement carried none of the confidence that passengers expected from their flight crew, and the experienced travelers in first class could sense that whatever was happening was far more serious than a routine operational delay. Senator Williams was already reaching for his phone to call his staff, while the Cloud Tech CEO was quietly uploading her video footage to secure cloud storage. The aircraft jolted slightly as the pushback tractor reconnected to the nose gear, but instead of pushing the plane away from the gate toward the runway, the massive vehicle was pulling Flight 847 back to the jet bridge that David had been so eager to leave behind. Every foot of movement toward the terminal felt like a countdown to career destruction, though David still couldn't fully comprehend the magnitude of what he had done. Captain Elena said quietly, "Maybe we should review the passenger removal procedures in our manual. If Mr. Washington really is FAA, then we might have violated federal guidelines for—" "He's not FAA," David interrupted, though his voice lacked any conviction. "Federal officials don't dress like that. They don't act like that. This whole situation is some kind of elaborate setup or misunderstanding that will get sorted out once the real authorities arrive." But even as David clung to his desperate rationalization, the jet bridge was extending toward their aircraft with mechanical inevitability, and through the small window in the aircraft door he could see figures waiting in the boarding area that clearly weren't routine airport personnel or airline supervisors. The knock on the cockpit door came with the authoritative rhythm that every pilot recognized as the signal that their aircraft was being boarded by federal officials, and when Elena opened the door, the men standing in the entrance wore the unmistakable credentials and bearing of government agents conducting serious official business. Behind them, stepping back onto Flight 847 for the second time that day, was Daniel Washington. But the man entering the aircraft now bore no resemblance to the casually dressed passenger David had dismissed and removed less than an hour earlier. Daniel had removed his hoodie to reveal a crisp white dress shirt, and hanging prominently from a lanyard around his neck was the gold badge of a senior federal aviation official. Captain Cross Daniel said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of the United States government rather than the polite cooperation he had shown as a passenger. "You need to step out of that seat immediately." David Cross remained frozen in his captain's seat, staring at Daniel Washington with the expression of a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. The gold federal badge gleaming against Daniel's white shirt was undeniable proof that everything David had assumed about passengers' authority and his own judgment had been catastrophically wrong. "You can't be back here," David stammered, his voice carrying none of the commanding authority he had wielded just an hour earlier. "This is a restricted flight deck. Only authorized personnel are allowed in the cockpit." Daniel finished stepping into the cramped space with the confidence of someone who knew aviation regulations better than most pilots. "As the Executive Director of Field Operations for the FAA, I am not only authorized to be here, Captain Cross, I'm authorized to ground this aircraft, suspend your license, and initiate a federal investigation into your conduct." The words hit David like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of federal authority and the promise of career-ending consequences. Elena Martinez pressed herself against the side of the cockpit, trying to become invisible as she watched her captain's world disintegrate before her eyes. As of 15 minutes ago, Daniel continued his tone, remaining professionally neutral despite the personal offense he had endured. "This aircraft has been officially grounded by the Federal Aviation Administration. Your pilot's license and medical certificate have been administratively suspended, pending an emergency review of your fitness for command authority. David felt the air leave his lungs as if he had been physically struck. Administrative suspension was the kind of nuclear option that the FAA reserved for pilots who posed immediate threats to aviation safety, and once that process began, the career destruction was swift and usually permanent. "You can't do this," David protested, though his voice had lost all trace of the confidence he had displayed while abusing his authority over a passenger he had assumed was powerless. "I'm a 22-year veteran. I have seniority rights. I was protecting the integrity of my cabin. You were enforcing your personal prejudices." Daniel corrected him, using federal authority to discriminate against a passenger based on his appearance and race. "That's not just a violation of airline policy, Captain Cross. That's a federal civil rights violation." Daniel turned to Elena, who was still pressed against the cockpit wall like she was trying to merge with the aircraft's structure. "First Officer Martinez, did you concur with Captain Cross's assessment that I posed a threat to flight safety or passenger comfort?" Elena looked at David, then back at Daniel, understanding that her answer would determine whether she would be walking away from this incident with her career intact or joining her captain in professional disgrace. Her years of training had taught her to support her captain's decisions, but her conscience and her professional judgment were telling her that supporting David's actions would be both wrong and career-ending. "No, Sir," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I advised Captain Cross that your ticket and identification had been verified by gate personnel. I told him you were showing platinum status in our system. I suggested that we focus on departure procedures rather than passenger issues." "Traitor," David hissed. But the accusation carried no weight coming from a man who had just destroyed his own career through spectacular poor judgment. Daniel ignored David's outburst and continued with the methodical professionalism of a federal official conducting a career-ending investigation. "Captain Cross, I want you to understand something very clearly. I didn't board this aircraft looking for problems. I was conducting a routine compliance audit, the kind of unannounced inspection that helps ensure airlines are following federal regulations and treating passengers with appropriate dignity." Daniel leaned against the cockpit doorframe, his badge catching the light as he delivered information that would haunt David for the rest of his life. "I wrote the VIP service protocols that your airline uses, Captain. I signed the training authorization for the flight simulator where you learn to operate this aircraft. I approved the safety procedures that govern your authority to remove passengers from flights." The revelation was devastating in its implications. Daniel wasn't just a federal official. He was the specific federal official responsible for overseeing the systems and procedures that David had just abused in such a spectacular fashion. Today, I sat in Seat 1A to observe whether Skyward Airlines was still prioritizing safety and passenger dignity over ego and prejudice, Daniel continued. "You failed that test in ways I didn't think were possible in modern commercial aviation." David tried to salvage some fragment of justification for his actions, clinging to the authority he had wielded so disastrously just hours earlier. "I have discretion under federal regulations to remove passengers who pose threats to safety. I was exercising proper command authority." "You were sitting?" Daniel replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had endured discrimination with dignity while documenting it for official review. "I was quietly taking notes about aircraft operations. I hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't caused any disturbance, hadn't violated any legitimate airline policy." Daniel's phone buzzed and he glanced at it briefly before returning his attention to the destruction of David Cross's career. "That was my assistant. The Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General has been notified of this incident. The Justice Department's Civil Rights Division has opened a preliminary investigation, and the Media Affairs Office has prepared a statement about federal officials being subjected to racial discrimination by airline personnel. The implications crashed over David like a tsunami of career-ending consequences. This wasn't just about losing his job or facing airline discipline. This was about federal criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and the kind of public disgrace that would follow him for the rest of his life. 22 years, David whispered, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. My father flew for Pan Am. My grandfather flew bombers in World War II. This was my heritage. Your heritage, Daniel said quietly, included the assumption that you could judge passengers by their skin color and remove them from aircraft based on your personal prejudices. That heritage needed to end, Captain Cross, and today it did. The finality in Daniel's voice made it clear that David Cross was no longer a captain, no longer a pilot, and no longer part of the aviation industry that had defined his entire adult life. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and absolutely deserved. The executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of Skyward Airlines' corporate headquarters had witnessed many difficult conversations over the years, but the emergency meeting called 72 hours after the Flight 847 incident carried an atmosphere of crisis that was unprecedented in the company's history. The mahogany conference table, surrounded by leather chairs that normally hosted discussions of quarterly profits and route expansion, had become the staging area for damage control on a scale that threatened the airline's survival. David Cross sat at one end of the table wearing his best civilian suit, the uniform that had defined his professional identity for 22 years, having been surrendered to airline security along with his company identification and airport access credentials. Beside him sat Stan Morrison, his union representative from the Airline Pilots Association, a weathered veteran of labor disputes who looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. "Stop fidgeting," Stan muttered under his breath, though his own discomfort was evident in the way he kept checking his phone for messages that might offer some escape from the impossible task of defending a pilot who had publicly discriminated against a federal aviation official while being recorded by multiple passengers. At the head of the table sat Harrison Blake, the CEO of Skyward Airlines, flanked by 3 attorneys from the firm of Cravath Swain and Moore, whose combined hourly billing rate exceeded most people's annual salaries. Blake had built his career on managing crises and protecting corporate interests, but the Flight 847 incident had created the kind of reputational disaster that could destroy decades of careful brand management in a matter of hours. "Gentlemen," Blake began, his voice carrying the cold precision of someone delivering news that would change lives forever. "We are not here to negotiate or discuss options. We are here to notify you that effective immediately, David Cross has been terminated for cause gross misconduct violation of federal civil rights laws and unauthorized abuse of command authority." The words hit the room like a physical force, though David had known this moment was inevitable from the instant he saw Daniel Washington's federal credentials. Stan Morrison opened his mouth to object, but Blake continued speaking with the relentless efficiency of corporate legal strategy. "The union has waived its right to contest this termination," Blake announced, delivering the final blow to any hope David might have harbored for professional survival. After reviewing the cockpit voice recorder transcripts and witness statements, ALPA has determined that Mr. Cross's actions violated both federal law and union codes of conduct in ways that cannot be defended or mitigated. David turned to stare at Stan Morrison with a look of absolute betrayal. "You're supposed to defend me. That's what I pay union dues for. That's what the brotherhood means." Stan's response was delivered with the tired resignation of someone who had spent 3 days trying to find legal strategies to defend the indefensible. "Rick, you called a federal aviation official boy while ordering him to sit in the back of the airplane. You did this on tape in front of witnesses, including a United States senator. The union can't protect members who commit federal crimes while representing our profession." But David's employment termination was only the beginning of consequences that would ripple through every aspect of his life. Across the table, Daniel Washington sat with the same calm professionalism he had displayed throughout the original incident, though now he wore a navy blue suit that emphasized his federal authority rather than the casual clothing that had triggered David's prejudiced assumptions. Captain Cross Daniel said, using the former title with deliberate irony, "The FAA has completed its preliminary investigation into your conduct. Based on cockpit voice recorder analysis, passenger testimony, and crew statements, we are implementing an emergency revocation of your airline transport pilot license, effective immediately." The word revocation carried weight that suspension could never match. Revocation meant that David's license wasn't temporarily withdrawn pending investigation. It was permanently destroyed, as if his 22 years of aviation experience had been erased from official records. "We are also flagging your medical certificate for mandatory psychiatric evaluation." Daniel continued reading from an official document bearing the FAA seal. "The agency has determined that your behavior demonstrates narcissistic personality traits and anti-authority impulses that are fundamentally incompatible with safe flight operations." David felt his last hope of professional redemption crumble into dust. Even if he could somehow challenge the license revocation, the psychiatric evaluation would ensure that he would never be considered mentally fit to operate commercial aircraft again. "You're destroying my life over a hoodie," David whispered, his voice cracking with the strain of confronting consequences he had never imagined when he decided to remove an appropriately dressed passenger from first class. "I'm removing a demonstrated threat to aviation safety," Daniel corrected him. "But there's something else you need to understand, David. This incident led us to conduct a comprehensive review of your passenger removal history." Daniel opened a thick folder that contained information David had hoped would never see the light of day. "Over the past 5 years, you removed 14 passengers from first-class seating. Every single one was a person of color. Every single removal was based on subjective assessments of appearance or behavior rather than legitimate safety concerns. The pattern recognition analysis was devastating in its implications. This wasn't a single incident of poor judgment. This was evidence of ongoing deliberate discrimination that had been enabled by airline policies and captain authority for years. "The Department of Justice has been notified," Daniel announced with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You're facing federal civil rights charges that carry potential prison time. The 12 passengers you previously discriminated against have been contacted by civil rights attorneys, and a class action lawsuit has been filed, seeking damages for emotional distress, humiliation, and violation of federal transportation rights." The room fell silent, except for the sound of David's world collapsing around him. 22 years of building a career, a reputation, and a professional legacy had been destroyed in less than an hour by his decision to judge a passenger by his clothing rather than his character. While David Cross was learning about the legal and professional consequences of his actions in a corporate boardroom, the court of public opinion was delivering its own swift and brutal judgment through the viral power of social media and digital documentation. The video recorded by the CloudTech CEO had been uploaded to multiple platforms with the simple title, "Racist Pilot Tries to Remove FAA Director from Flight." Instant karma, and within 6 hours it had been viewed over 20 million times. The footage was devastating in its clarity and completeness. Every word of David's discriminatory language had been captured in high-definition audio. Every gesture of intimidation was visible from multiple angles, and Daniel Washington's dignified responses made David's behavior look even more outrageous by contrast. The comment sections were scrolling so fast that individual responses blurred into a river of condemnation and disbelief. "Did this pilot really just call a federal official boy?" wrote one viewer. "This is 2024, not 1954. I'm a flight attendant," posted another. "Everyone in aviation knows Captain Cross. He's been pulling this garbage for years, and finally someone with power caught him. The guy in the hoodie is literally the top aviation safety official in the country," observed a third commenter. "This pilot just tried to bully his own boss without knowing it." David had been at home trying to process the magnitude of his professional destruction when his wife Ellen found him in their living room, staring blankly at the wall where his aviation awards and commendations had hung for decades. "David," she said, her voice carrying a tone he had never heard before. Not anger, not sadness, but the cold distance of someone who had realized she no longer recognized the man she had married. "Have you seen what's happening online?" She handed him her iPad, and David found himself watching his own career destruction from the perspective of a passenger who had filmed every moment of his spectacular failure of judgment. Seeing himself on screen, red-faced and shouting racial slurs at a calmly dignified federal official, was like watching a stranger destroy everything David had worked for his entire adult life. The video had been picked up by news organizations around the world. CNN was running it as their lead story with the banner, "Pilot's Racist Rant Leads to Federal Investigation." Fox News was discussing it as an example of workplace discrimination in aviation. The BBC had made it the top international story focusing on American airline safety culture and federal oversight. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing," Ellen said, her voice hollow with the recognition that their lives had been permanently altered by David's 40 minutes of poor judgment. "There are news vans parked outside. Reporters are calling our neighbors. My sister saw it trending on TikTok and called crying because she was so ashamed." David scrolled through the comments, each one feeling like a physical blow to whatever remained of his self-respect. Pilot of prejudice, they were calling him. Captain Racist. The aviation industry's biggest disgrace. His name had become synonymous with everything wrong with institutional discrimination and abuse of authority. The doorbell rang with the insistent rhythm of someone who wouldn't accept being ignored, and David automatically started to rise before Ellen stopped him with a gesture. "Don't," she said. "It's probably more reporters or process servers or federal agents. I can't deal with any more of this today." But the visitor wasn't willing to be ignored. The doorbell continued ringing, followed by knocking that grew progressively more insistent until David finally walked to the front door and peered through the window. Standing on his front porch was a young man in a baseball cap holding a thick folder of legal documents. David recognized him immediately as one of the process servers who had been visiting his house regularly since the incident, delivering lawsuits and legal notifications that were accumulating like evidence of his destroyed life. David crossed the server, called through the door, though he clearly knew he had the right address. "Yes," David replied, opening the door with the resignation of someone who had learned to expect bad news. "You're being served with a federal civil rights lawsuit filed by the 12 passengers you discriminated against over the past 5 years," the server announced, pushing the documents into David's hands with professional efficiency. "You're also being served with a defamation and emotional distress lawsuit filed by Daniel Washington personally, and Skyward Airlines is suing you for breach of contract and damage to corporate reputation." David looked down at the stack of legal papers, each one representing years of litigation and financial ruin that would extend far beyond his destroyed aviation career. "My pension," he said quietly, speaking more to himself than to the process server. "My retirement accounts." "Frozen pending the outcome of federal investigation," the server replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who delivered life-destroying news for a living. "Good luck, Captain. You're gonna need it." As David closed the door and leaned against it, clutching the legal documents that would define the rest of his life, Ellen appeared in the hallway carrying a suitcase and wearing the expression of someone who had made a decision that couldn't be unmade. "I'm going to stay with my mother until this is resolved," she said, not meeting his eyes. "I can't be associated with what you've done. I can't have my name connected to this. I'm sorry, David, but you humiliated us all." The sound of Ellen's car pulling out of the driveway marked the final collapse of everything David Cross had built over his 22-year career. He was alone in a house he could no longer afford, facing legal battles he couldn't win with a reputation that would follow him to his grave. Outside, the news vans continued their vigil, waiting for any development in the story that had transformed an airline captain into a symbol of everything wrong with discrimination and abuse of authority in American aviation. David Cross had wanted to protect the exclusivity of first-class service, but instead he had become the most famous example of how prejudice and power could destroy a life in less time than it takes to fly from New York to London. 6 months after Flight 847 returned to its gate at JFK, the main auditorium at the Federal Aviation Administration headquarters in Washington, D.C., was packed beyond capacity with an audience that represented every level of the American aviation industry. Pilots wearing the uniforms of major airlines sat beside flight attendants, airport security personnel, and airline executives, all gathered to witness the implementation of new federal regulations that would reshape how authority and discrimination were handled in commercial aviation. The atmosphere in the room was respectful but electric with anticipation, because everyone present understood they were attending a historic moment, the day that the aviation industry would officially acknowledge that passenger dignity was just as important as passenger safety, and that federal authority would no longer tolerate discrimination disguised as professional judgment. Daniel Washington stood at the podium wearing a perfectly tailored Navy suit that emphasized his federal authority. But when he began to speak, his voice carried none of the anger or vindication that the audience might have expected from someone who had endured public discrimination. Instead, his tone reflected the measured professionalism of a government official who had transformed a personal injustice into an opportunity for industry-wide improvement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel began, his words echoing through the packed auditorium, "we are gathered today to implement the Washington Protocol, a comprehensive framework for bias recognition and prevention in commercial aviation that will ensure no passenger ever again faces discrimination based on their appearance, their race, or the assumptions others make about their worthiness to occupy the seat they have purchased." The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, representing not just support for the new regulations, but recognition that the aviation industry was finally addressing problems that had persisted for decades. In the audience, pilots who had witnessed discrimination remained silent. Flight attendants who had been ordered to participate in illegal passenger removals nodded with relief, and airline executives calculated the cost of compliance against the much higher cost of federal prosecution. Command authority in aviation is not a privilege that allows crew members to enforce their personal prejudices. Daniel continued, clicking a remote that displayed the new protocol guidelines on massive screens throughout the auditorium. "It is a responsibility to serve every passenger with equal dignity, regardless of how they dress, how they speak, or what assumptions their appearance might trigger in the minds of crew members." The Washington Protocol represented more than just new regulations. It was a complete philosophical shift in how the aviation industry would approach the relationship between authority and service. Every pilot in the United States would now be required to undergo annual recertification that included specific training on unconscious bias, appropriate use of passenger removal authority, and the legal consequences of discriminatory behavior. Effective immediately, Daniel announced any pilot who uses federal aviation authority to discriminate against passengers will face automatic license revocation regardless of their years of service or previous record. We are ending the era of the God complex in commercial aviation because the safety of our airspace depends on crew members who understand that their authority exists to serve the public, not to judge them. The standing ovation that erupted throughout the auditorium lasted for nearly 5 minutes, with pilots, flight attendants, and aviation officials rising to their feet in recognition that their industry had finally taken a definitive stand against the kind of discrimination that had damaged both individual passengers and the reputation of commercial aviation as a whole. Meanwhile, 300 miles away at JFK International Airport, the same terminal where Daniel Washington had once been escorted off an aircraft in handcuffs, was witnessing a different kind of transportation drama. A white shuttle bus with faded paint and the logo of Quick Ride Budget Transit wheezed to a stop at the curb outside Terminal 4, its engine coughing with the mechanical exhaustion of a vehicle that had seen better decades. The driver's door opened, and a man in an ill-fitting polyester uniform climbed out into the cold New York morning. His name tag read simply, Rick, and the passenger reaching for luggage assistance would never have recognized him as the former Captain David Cross, whose aviation career had ended in the most spectacular public disgrace in airline history. David's transformation from commanding $4 million aircraft to driving airport shuttle buses was complete and irreversible. His silver hair had thinned and grayed further during months of unemployment and legal proceedings. His once athletic frame had softened from stress eating and alcohol, and his eyes carried the hollow look of someone who had lost not just a career, but their entire sense of identity and purpose. "Careful with that guitar case," called out a young passenger in a hoodie and headphones, the same casual style of clothing that had triggered David's discriminatory behavior 6 months earlier. "Yes, sir. I've got it," David replied quietly, lifting the heavy case with hands that had once controlled aircraft carrying hundreds of passengers across oceans. "I'll be very careful." As David loaded luggage into the shuttle bus, a group of Skyward Airlines pilots walked past on their way into the terminal, their uniforms crisp and their rolling flight bags marking them as members of the profession that David would never rejoin. One of them was Elena Martinez, now wearing the 4 stripes of a captain after being promoted to fill one of the positions vacated by pilots who had been terminated during the industry-wide review of discriminatory behavior. Elena paused when she recognized the shuttle bus driver, and for a moment their eyes met across the gap that separated her successful career from his destroyed life. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction at seeing her former captain reduced to manual labor, only the kind of sadness that comes from witnessing preventable tragedy. Elena gave David a small nod of acknowledgement before continuing toward the terminal, where she would command her own aircraft with the kind of professional dignity and respect for all passengers that the Washington Protocol now required of every pilot in American aviation. She understood, as David never had, that true authority came not from the power to exclude others, but from the wisdom to lift them up. The transformation of American commercial aviation didn't happen overnight, but the changes that began with Flight 847 rippled through every airline, every training program, and every cockpit in the country, with the force of long-overdue justice finally being served. The Washington Protocol became more than just federal regulation. It became a symbol of how individual acts of courage and dignity could reshape entire industries when confronted with institutional discrimination. Daniel Washington continued his career with the Federal Aviation Administration, but his legacy extended far beyond regulatory compliance and safety oversight. His measured response to discrimination, his refusal to seek personal revenge, and his focus on creating positive change rather than simply punishing wrongdoing became a model for how people in positions of authority should respond when they witness or experience injustice. In airports across the country, passengers began to notice changes that went beyond new training programs and updated policies. Flight crews treated everyone with the same professional courtesy, regardless of their appearance. Passenger removals became rare and carefully documented events subject to federal review, and the culture of commercial aviation slowly shifted toward the kind of respectful service that Daniel Washington had advocated for throughout his career. The story of Flight 847 was taught in aviation schools, business ethics courses, and civil rights seminars as an example of how quickly authority could be abused, and how completely careers could be destroyed when personal prejudices overrode professional judgment. But more importantly, it became an inspiration for people who had experienced discrimination but chose to respond with dignity and systematic change, rather than anger and personal retaliation. David Cross never flew as a pilot again, spending his remaining working years in service jobs that reminded him daily of how far he had fallen from the heights of commercial aviation. His story served as a permanent warning to anyone tempted to use their authority to enforce their prejudices, while Daniel Washington's response demonstrated that true power came not from the ability to punish others, but from the wisdom to create systems that prevented future injustice. The Washington Protocol became the gold standard for aviation bias prevention worldwide, adopted by airlines and aviation authorities across the globe as a model for transforming discrimination into opportunity for growth. Captain David Cross's case study became mandatory training for all commercial pilots, ensuring that his moment of prejudice would serve as a permanent lesson in the consequences of using authority to enforce personal biases rather than serve the public good. Daniel Washington's legacy extended far beyond the aviation industry, inspiring people in every profession to recognize that dignity and respect are not privileges to be earned through appearance or status, but basic human rights that should be protected by those in positions of authority. His calm response under pressure became a masterclass in how to transform personal injustice into positive social change through proper channels and unwavering professionalism. The story serves as a powerful reminder that true leadership means recognizing the humanity and dignity in every person we encounter, regardless of their clothing, their background, or our assumptions about where they belong. Character is revealed not in moments of comfort and control, but in how we choose to treat those we believe have no power over us. And in the end, the universe has a way of ensuring that justice prevails when courage meets opportunity at 30,000 feet. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more real-life inspired stories about justice, dignity, and the power of doing what's right even when it's difficult. Share your thoughts in the comments about how assumptions and prejudices can be challenged, and remember that every interaction is an opportunity to either build bridges or create barriers. Together, we can create a world where everyone is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve, regardless of how they look or where others think they belong.